I'm Daniel. I'm an organization designer, system thinker, etc., etc. Been thinking about organizations and communities for a while. Started my career in the hospitality industry, which traumatized me just the right way to really start caring about how we create less hierarchical structures where the people at the top are very stressed out and the people at the bottom have ideas that those at the top need, but there is no communication and no way to actually make this work together. So most recently, we started a thing called RnDAO, stands for Research and Development DAO, and we do research about different topics, complex topics around DAOs, and then build products for DAO tooling to empower human collaboration is the mission. And so this is one of the latest research projects that is now evolving into a tool that will facilitate a little bit the framework that I'm gonna share now, which is the output of the last 3-4 months of research into this. So the project started with us seeing just in Twitter a bunch of people asking, how do I measure community? Which would often devolve into a discussion about what community means, and that's usually where the conversation ended. So there was a lot of agreement on what not to measure, like let's not measure the number of people, because that doesn't really say whether it's a healthy community or not, and it doesn't really mean much. Let's not measure the number of messages, because, for example, when there is a conflict, we can see that the number of messages spikes. But equally, when there is a very interesting discussion, the number of messages spikes. So that doesn't really tell us much. And let's not just measure engagement, because that really doesn't mean much. You can have people who are very heavily engaged and are continuously detracting from the community, and then a shock comes and the community immediately disperses, and other communities seem less engaged or have different patterns of engagement, and a shock comes and the community actually becomes stronger and thrives and adapts and changes and so on. So we started thinking about this, and first it was like, okay, so what do we mean by community, and can we converge around a working definition of community? And let's try to understand this a little bit deeper. And where that took us was that fundamentally all the different definitions of community that we can find, both from practitioners and different disciplines in academic research, in general had 5 key elements. One, people, at least for the types of communities that we're talking about. Then there is a place or a platform. It can be a physical location or a series of digital platforms, wherever, but there is a platform where people need to gather. Then as people gather and build relationships with each other, this creates a social structure, and you can actually map what is that structure of like who's relating with whom. And if you abstract this, it creates some sort of network graph. And so that's a fundamental property of the community. And also the shape of these relationships, whether they're like parent-child relationships of like, you take care of me, but you have authority over me, relationships of mutual consent or mutual agreement and so on, or competition relationships, whatever sort of relationships that people are having will also shape that structure and will shape the community. Then what really starts to take it away from being just a social network or away from what Mark Zuckerberg would define or community, which is basically just users or everyone with whom there is a relationship or an interaction, and into really being a community is that, at least for us, what we define as a real community or community is a shared identity or a shared theme that everyone gathers together. And the shared identity is really the key here for understanding a lot of the properties that communities then developed. Because what we end up doing is that we start to identify with this construct that is the community, that is the shared identity. So we can say I'm Colombian, or I'm French, or I'm English, or I'm whatever, Italian. And so we then start to identify with this idea of Italianness. That is a construct that we have, and probably every individual's idea of Italianness, of every Italian, is a little bit different, but they all agree that they are Italian. So they're all agreeing into something that is not quite the same thing. It's just the idea that everyone has that is a little bit different, but they all feel that they are agreeing. So there is kind of like a discrepancy there in that you can think that you're part of the same community, even though you're part of, in your imaginary, actually different constructs, different ideas of these. But the sense that you identify with this thing, that you also associate the other people. So you're also an Italian, or you're also someone who's in Web3, or you're also a developer, or you're also a whatever it is, creates that sort of bond of identification with someone else. And importantly, when we start to identify with this bigger thing, we start to adopt a lot of the same ways in which we treat ourselves with this larger collective. So if we're in a position of danger, we're going to try to protect our survival, and we do the same thing with the collective. And this is a little bit what can explain that people sacrifice themselves for a nation state, for example, is because they actually identify with that nation state. They see the nation state is being attacked, they enter a fight or flight response or something like that, and then they defend it the best way they can, the same way that they would defend themselves if they were in a knife fight. And equally, this can have some of the really amazing properties of people really caring for that collective identity or that collective that they are imagining, and whichever way they perceive that collective to be. But then identification is not enough, because with identification, you can still end up having a lot of toxicity, and you have these in cults where it's all about the collective and the individuals sort of disappear and they fade into the background. And so you can end up with the sort of enforcing the rules at the disregard of every other individual into it. So the final property that we are associating with communities, or at least this somewhat holistic understanding of communities that I'll go to develop a little bit more, was the bonds that we have with the other people, and whether we have a sense of reciprocity and general goodwill with the other people who are part of the community. And perhaps a good example here is the prison inmate, that they might identify a lot with being a prisoner and with fellow prisoners, and they're like, yeah, we're the same, we're all prisoners, but they're not necessarily going to look after the other prisoners. So even though you have this collective identity, you don't quite have a community in that they're more likely to coerce each other into obtaining whatever selfish benefit they want, rather than as a collective trying to improve everyone's lot. So that brings to the fundamental tension of the community, that is that we all desire to be unique and special, and we all desire to do well by ourselves and achieve certain things, and everyone has their own ego. And at the same time, we all desire to belong to a collective. And so the community is, in a way, a vehicle to achieve our needs and desires. And we need to be parts of these collectives. And that's why we evolved this sense of community, etc., is because evolutionary-wise, it's a selection mechanism. If we can work in collectives, we're more successful than individual, and so on. So we use these collectives to satisfy our needs. But even beyond that, we come to have fundamentally ingrained the need to belong into a collective. The Nazis did some horrendous experiments with babies in that they will satisfy all the needs of the babies, but no one will give them affection, and the babies will actually die, or all their biological needs. So it's very, very ingrained in us, the need to connect with fellow human beings. Equally, some interviews with sexual workers lead to say that a very significant part of their work is not the sex, but actually is the skin touch and the emotional connection, however shallow in such an extreme situation might be, but that they fulfill that for a lot of their clients. So it's a very deeply ingrained human need, the need to belong. And so the collective is, again, in that tension of I need to belong to a collective, which means, in a way, abstracting my identity and merging it with this collective identity, while also trying to have my own individual identity and my autonomy throughout. And maybe the way to resolve this tension is what Bene Brown quotes very beautifully, that says we cannot truly belong to a collective until we belong to ourselves, which is starting with authenticity and so on. And so from this, we can understand that if you actually want to create a healthy community, one of the fundamental things is that first people know who they are, and then enter the community in that relationship with first belonging to themselves and knowing why they're there, what they're good for, like what kind of skills they have and so on, what they can offer, what they're looking for. And then they enter in a mutual advantageous relationship, reciprocal relationships, rather than forcing themselves to cut their own personality and take a professional mask, or what happens in corporate culture, that people show a very limited persona because they haven't done the inner work and so on. And so you end up with these conflict in between the two identities, which fundamentally makes the community fragile and so on. So we had the 5 properties that I was talking about, the people, the place, the social structure, the collective identity, and then the relationships between the people, the reciprocity or the bonds that we have between them. So then we're like, okay, cool. So what do we do with this, and how do we understand whether a community is healthy or not? And that brought us to then start to say, well, historically, the way we understand health, and medicine has been the discipline that has been looking at health per excellence. So they were at first looking, okay, we measure health or try to understand health as the absence of illness. So if we can notice that there are some illnesses, then this is not healthy. But again, for what we were trying to achieve, which was fundamentally understanding if there is a shock to the system, some communities fall apart, others become stronger. Looking for symptoms of ill health is not particularly useful and is hard, and the variety of them is humongous. So it didn't quite work with us. So we started to dig a little bit deeper and ended up with this idea of the community as a series of nested systems. So we have the community as a construct. The community exists in an environment where there are other communities, equally other identities, other collectives that people belong to. People come in and out of these collectives and so on. And so we have this broader ecosystem of other communities and other individuals, etc. If this broader ecosystem where the community is nested is unhealthy, the community is not going to be healthy itself. It's reliant on this ecosystem for its own survival. This is not a one-on-one relationship. Communities can migrate and so on, but that is still difficult to do and constitute a danger and so on. So then within the ecosystem, we have the community, and within the community, we have different groups or subgroups that form. These can be cliques, which are just in the social structure naturally arising, or they can be more formal, like the teams or squads or pods that are created and so on. And we have some overlap usually between the formal structure and the informal structure. The formal structure, what people understand, this is the way this community is meant to be structured or divided or segmented or something like that, and the way the people actually relate. And the two never quite match. And a lot of issues in organizations come from the two not really matching, because people have a fantasy of what it's meant to be, but the work actually happens in a completely different way for people interacting in other forms and so on. But importantly, we need these cliques and these subgroups to be healthy. And if they're not able to function themselves, then the community will be very fragile. And within the cliques, then we have the relationships between the individuals, and finally we have the individual. So we have this nested structure that we need to assess to really get a proper understanding of community health. Now, that means that actually assessing this stuff becomes quite hard, and assessing health at these individual levels is different, but it becomes kind of hard. So what we start to get was more a layer cake sort of model of community health, where we could use a similar approach that is not only the absence of health, but let's look at properties that promote health and so on, and indicators that give us a high likelihood that something will be healthy without ever knowing for certain. A little bit the same way we treat our bodies. It's like we know exercise is good. If someone is doing exercise, that's great. If your pulse has a certain frequency, most likely you're going to be alive in the next 10 minutes. I cannot know for sure, but I have a high likelihood of knowing that if you have a pulse right now, you'll also have a pulse in 10 minutes and probably the next week from now if that pulse is relatively healthy. So from that, we end up with 3 main layers. One, which we call the vital signs. So these are things that are relatively easy to assess that we can use to understand whether a community is healthy. Then we have an understanding the subsystems, these nested systems below, so I can look at the pods, at the individuals, are they healthy themselves, and so on. And we can discuss later on what this can mean. And then a third layer that's more the enabling factors for health, which can be, for example, trust, that tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that if I trust other people also tend to have a trusting behavior towards myself, and I take more risks on behalf of the collective, which leads to more positive things happening in the collective and more people seeing this and emulating it and so on, and it creates a positive spiral. And on the other side, if there is distrust, we have a huge tendency to take the worst interpretation. Someone says like, hey, how are you? And I'm like, what? are you implying? That I'm not good and hence I didn't do a good job or something like that? Then the worst possible interpretation, and it just spirals downwards with only like very shock events, like very open conflicts or something like that, that if they're handled positively in a good way and people feel this is great, that changes the direction of the spiral. Or if they're handled poorly, then the spiral goes down and so on. So in assessing the vital signs, which is where we're starting, we then ended up with the idea of we need to do two things. We need to understand behavior and we need to understand perception, because so much of the community is just happening in the psychological layer inside people's heads, and is more a prediction of what's likely to occur and how are other people thinking. And so I'm going to adapt my behavior based on that and based on my beliefs, rather than something that is material. But as I'm saying, it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you understand people's perception, you have a really good understanding of what's very likely to happen, not complete certainty, but you have a fairly good understanding. And then you can see the behavior to understand how these perceptions are distributed across the community, to then understand how different perceptions in different areas are going to impact the way this community works. And I'll go to that into a second. So for perception, we end up developing what's called a pulse survey, because the issue was like, if you try to do long surveys, they take a lot of time, not many people reply, and also it's kind of hard to do them frequently, so you don't get benchmark data and an understanding of what's the trajectory, because every community will have a different idea. Like, I don't know if you know about the Colombian paradox, but for example, Colombia for many years was the happiest country in the world, while they were tearing each other apart through the internal wars and so on. And so the question was, why are Colombians so happy? And one of the possible explanations is, no, they just have culturally a tendency to give high ratings. That doesn't mean that they believe they're happier than other countries. It's just that they use scales in a way that they tend towards the higher numbers of the scale, and it's simply a learned behavior. So because of that, you kind of need that benchmark data, because you cannot assess it at one point and then know that in 6 months what's going to happen, or what an 8 or a 9, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing across communities. So we then ask people, how do you identify with this community and how do you feel about the other people? And there is thankfully some ways that have been validated to assess that. And then we look at the communication data to assess the shape of the social network. And with the shape of the social network, what we can then start to look is the number of relationships that people have to entertain on regular basis, as well as where these perceptions are localized. So we have hairball sort of networks where everyone is in contact with everyone. And if a hairball network is fairly small, this is okay. This is usually like the 2-pizza team kind of thing. They can be very effective because there is a lot of lateral communication. But if in these small hairball networks, you have one person who's primarily a sender and others who are a receiver, is probably going to be very fragile, because it's depending upon a single person and there is no lateral communication. So something happens in that relationship, the whole thing can collapse. On the other hand, you can have different structures in these hairball networks, and then we can look at the structure that these can have as it scales. Because one of the biggest issues with communities is when they were small, you had a lot of closeness and you had a really strong sense of community, and then it grows and it starts to kind of lose its magic. It becomes a little bit more anonymous, and the old timers don't quite feel it was the same thing it used to be. And that largely happens is because the shape of the network is changing so much, and these close relationships that they had become very distant. And the time you need to wait for other people to reply to you, or the number of strangers that you're interacting with, becomes a lot bigger. You have a lot less context of what every person is doing. And so it becomes very different. The antidote for that we can actually look at the structure of the network, is when we have what's called a small world. So we have these tight clusters that are loosely coupled with other tight clusters. So we have a series of small worlds that are still connected between them. If it goes too far, it becomes fragmented, and then the community splits. And even if people have a strong sense of community, they probably have a strong sense of community of different communities. And we know that at that point, it's very likely that they're going to end up in a conflict or misalignment sooner rather than later, because they're passionate, but they're not really talking. So they're probably passionate about different things or different ideas of what the community is. And anyway, that's I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna kind of cut it there, but that's roughly where we are. If you wanna chat a little bit more about this, there is still a lot to explore and a lot more to be doing. So thank you for listening.